Usually, the UFC keeps its chaos inside the octagon, but sometimes the biggest drama is what happens before the show starts. Whether that's remaking a main card on 24-hour notice, moving events across the country on fight week, and even canceling enormous pay-per-views just days out, sometimes UFC cards don't go the way they should. So this is the 7 most chaotic UFC events ever, going from least crazy to most. Logistically, the biggest headache the UFC staff would have ever had in the history of the sport is without a shadow of a doubt UFC 232. It was the final card of 2018 on December 29th and began like any other event. They put on an incredible card together with 2 title fights, Jon Jones vs Alexander Gustafsson 2 and Amanda Nunes vs Chris Cyborg. The Jon Gus fight was, of course, a rematch of their first Hall of Fame clash, where Gustafsson took Jon to an absolute war. It was supposed to go down at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, the venue the UFC uses most. But on December 23rd, just a matter of days before the fights were set to take place, shocking news hit UFC fans.
The big light heavyweight fight here in Las Vegas with Jones and Gustafsson, the super fight between the women, Nunes and Cyborg, and we're moving it from Las Vegas to the Forum in LA. Tickets will go on sale Wednesday, and people who bought tickets here in Las Vegas can get a full refund, and we'll figure out how to get you seated in LA if you're interested in moving to LA to watch the fight.
And it was all one man's fault, Jon Jones.
We were informed earlier this week by the United States Anti-Doping Agency, who administers our anti-doping program, that a urine sample collected from Jon Jones on December 9th of this year tested positive for a very, very small amount of a long-term metabolite of the same prohibited substance for which he was sanctioned in July 2017. But I think most importantly, 2 factors. Number one, both USADA and worldwide anti-doping experts told us that this was not a re-ingestion of this prohibited substance.
But here, it was the results of a previous PED problem that put the entire card in jeopardy. It turns out the drugs in his system, the same ones he had already been banned for 15 months for, were having this bizarre pulsing effect on his body. Essentially, tiny amounts of the drugs were still making him test positive, although USADA's stance was that they wouldn't give him performance-enhancing effects anymore. But fans weren't happy with Jon.
Tell me, why are we still having this guy here instead of seeing a 2-year suspension like Frank Mir?
Why are we still what? What's the question? Hold on.
Hold
on.
Sit down.
I'm sitting down.
I want to
Thank
take the
you.
mic from her. Better questions, better
just wanna
journalism.
know
I don't understand what your question is.
Is there a real
What's the reason?
better
for
journalism?
it?
With just days to the event, the Nevada State Athletic Commission wouldn't be able to license Jon Jones, but somehow the Californian Commission would. So the UFC somehow moved the entire event. That's 26 fighters and their teams, the octagon itself, all the UFC staff, and everything that goes into putting on the show. All of this work, and remember, it was literally Christmas Day in between. Most likely, no one at the UFC enjoyed their Christmas and was just planning logistics the entire time. But perhaps the most damaged party were the fans. They would have had flights planned, hotels booked, UFC tickets paid for, and literally thousands of dollars worth of expenses to come and see the fights. While the UFC did refund the tickets, fans were left out of pocket and their plans ruined. But as always, the show must go on. And in the end, it ended up being one of the best nights of fights of the entire year. You had Volkanovski's breakout fight against Chad Mendes, Amanda Nunes KO'd Cyborg in one of the craziest fights ever, and Jon Jones utterly dominated Gustafsson to reclaim his light heavyweight title. Oh, and on the topic of Jon Jones, this isn't the first time he's at the center of causing chaos to a UFC event, but this time, the entire event was cancelled because of him. This video is made in partnership with Kalshi, and if there's one thing this video proves, it's that in the UFC, nobody actually knows what's going to happen. Kalshi is the largest legal prediction market in the US, over 1 million users, available in all 50 states. It's peer-to-peer trading on real-world events, like a stock market for things that actually matter to you. And unlike a sportsbook, they can't cut you off just because you're winning. The market right now is asking who McGregor fights next, and the favorite is Carlos Prates at just 30%. A contract costs you 32 cents. If it happens, you get $1 back per contract, so $100 becomes over $300 if you're right. Personally, given how unpredictable everything around Conor has been, I wouldn't be fading any of those options. If you want to trade your prediction, go to kalshi.com/markfighting, links in the description. Sign up, trade $20, and Kalshi will give you $20 back. It was UFC 151, and Jon Jones was aiming to make his 4th title defense against Dan Henderson. Hendo had just KO'd Fedor in Strikeforce and won the unanimous fight of the year against Shogun Rua. It's safe to say he was a dangerous test for Jon Jones.
Do you think he can take a punch?
I don't know. Hopefully he takes a few.
That's the plan, certainly.
For sure.
But just 8 days out from the event, news broke. Henderson was injured and pulled from the fight. While obviously a headache and a stressful time, a fighter getting injured isn't anything out of the ordinary for the UFC. But this was only the tip of the iceberg of the chaos that UFC 151 was. Immediately, the UFC was searching for a replacement, and they landed on one gangster willing to take on a fight on 8 days' notice, up a weight class against perhaps the greatest young fighter of all time, Chael Sonnen. With not only their respective skill level, but the fight he hadn't been active, Chael Sonnen would have been an enormous underdog. But despite his willingness to take a crazy risk, something happened that no one expected. Jon Jones, of all people, said no.
I don't know why a guy who was a world champion and considered by many one of the pound-for-pound best wouldn't fight anybody. I don't know the answer to that. It's baffling to me. I've never seen it before, and I don't know. We've never, ever had a fighter refuse to fight somebody. Absolutely flat out refused to fight a guy. Never happened. This is one of those selfish, disgusting decisions that doesn't just affect you. Good for you, Jon Jones. You're rich and you got some money. You don't need to take this fight. But there's a bunch of guys on the undercard that this is how they feed their family.
And with a supposed weak card underneath them, UFC 151 was entirely cancelled just 8 days out. Yet again, all those who traveled, booked flights, were getting nothing for their money, and 24 fighters were left with nothing to fight for after weeks and months of training. It turns out that Jon's coach Greg Jackson had advised his fighter not to accept the fight, saying that with the weight cut, he'd only have a few sessions on the mat to plan for the different style that Chael poses compared to Henderson.
We didn't know that at the time if he was ready or wasn't ready, and 3 days is tough to fight anybody on, and especially if you want to be prepared and taken serious as an athlete.
And while it's a very safe approach, it is his job to guide his fighter through moments like this. But when Dana found out this was the case, well, he was furious. He called Greg Jackson a literal sport killer. It turns out that Hendo and Chael may have had a little sneaky plan together to set up Jon Jones. See, they were training partners at the time, and it was revealed that Henderson had been injured for 3 weeks prior to letting the UFC know and was keeping quiet just in case he'd be ready in time. So the rumor is that for an entire month, Chael knew there was a chance he'd be fighting Jon Jones for the title and began preparing for him. It's definitely a crafty veteran move from Sonnen if it's true, and perhaps Jones was wise to back out. Either way, it left UFC 151 completely cancelled, with the UFC moving Jon Jones to fight Vitor Belfort at UFC 152, a fight he ultimately won. But he still ended up fighting Chael.
Chael's a nice guy, especially once you get to know him. Of course, you're not going to hate him, but, you just think that what he does and says is funny a lot of times. I think Chael knows that he's got a really tough fight and he's going to have to do a lot of things right to beat Jon Jones. But, and Jon Jones, like I said, I think had a much better, easier time with Chael if he would have taken the fight the first time. Now Chael's going to be prepared.
Jon went on to fight Chael a couple months later, winning in the first round, but the fight with Dan Henderson never went down. The two did meet in a submission grappling match many years later, with Jones tapping Hendo out with an arm triangle in 6 minutes. But to this day, fans remember how Jon Jones backed out of a fight against Chael Sonnen, where he would have been a massive betting favorite and destroyed an entire pay-per-view as a result. This next time, though, it wasn't a fighter's fault for the chaos. Instead, it was due to the entire world shutting down because of COVID-19. It was UFC 249, May 2020, and the world was reeling from the pandemic. Lockdown was in full effect almost globally. People weren't going out and the world had stopped. The UFC had a monster pay-per-view set to go down in New York, and it was headlined by the most cursed fight ever, Khabib versus Tony Ferguson. This was the 5th time the UFC had tried to make this fight happen. With the uncertainty of the pandemic at the time, it seemed inevitable that all sports, the UFC included, would disappear for the foreseeable future. But Dana White had other plans.
We've been closely monitoring the situation with the coronavirus and its potential impact on the health and safety of UFC athletes, staff, and fans around the world. We're moving forward with all our UFC live events, but we're going to adapt to these unprecedented circumstances.
New York has said no, but Dana White was trying to buy a private island looking at a casino in California and was willing to move heaven and earth to keep the fights coming. And eventually, California, who were a little more relaxed in their restrictions, allowed the UFC to host an event in an empty arena.
Saturday's fights, and I gotta go. I'm gonna be in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm gonna be doing commentary in an empty arena. No one's gonna be near me. Everybody has to be really far away from each other. We're gonna be on separate corners of the octagon, which fucking sucks.
What it meant for the fight card, though, was utter chaos. Most importantly, Khabib wasn't able to get to America due to travel restrictions, and so the fight everyone wanted to see most was canceled for the 5th time.
We found out that Khabib Nurmagomedov is officially out of his scheduled fight with Tony Ferguson for April 18th at UFC 249. He made the announcement via his Instagram. Earlier in the week, during an Instagram Live, Nurmagomedov revealed he was in Russia, and due to travel restrictions, he was essentially stuck there due to the coronavirus outbreak that has taken the globe by storm.
Cyril Gane had his fight canceled due to a lung issue. Bilal Muhammad's fight canceled as his opponent got COVID, and Jessica Andrade versus Rose Namajunas for the title also canceled as Rose had lost people close to her due to the virus. Justin Gaethje ended up replacing Khabib. The entire fight card changed, but somehow the show went ahead. And in the empty arena, it felt like we were watching some illegal underground fight where you could hear every blow all too much.
You can not only hear every punch, which seems to be what everyone's talking about, every punch, every kick, every scream. Like, you can hear the corners talking, you can hear the commentary. I mean, there were fighters that were saying they could hear the commentary so well that they would use it to their advantage.
Even the fights themselves were wild. We had Ngannou's 22nd KO of Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Cejudo finishing Dominic Cruz, and Cruz accusing the referee of being drunk.
My experience of him was smelling like he had been out all night the night before, like cigarettes and alcohol. So, and he could not make eye contact with me. I have never in 25 fights had a referee that could not make eye contact with me before a fight.
And then, Gaethje's brutal beatdown of Tony Ferguson that became truly uncomfortable to watch towards the end. The world was in utter chaos, and through no fault of the UFC itself, the show goes down in history for being an absolute mess from start to finish. But from that, let's look at the disaster that was the UFC's biggest show of all time, UFC 200. UFC 200 was a massive milestone event for the company, and they wanted to put on the biggest card possible. For reference, UFC 100 had Jon Jones, GSP, and Brock Lesnar all competing. So naturally, their first idea was to have their biggest star Conor McGregor and his rematch versus Nate Diaz as the headliner. And for a while, that was the concrete plan, until McGregor essentially didn't want to play ball with the UFC.
So Conor basically had said that he didn't want to come to Las Vegas. And we had a tour plan. We were going to start in Vegas. We were going to then go to Stockton and then New York. And then he could go back to, to Iceland where he is right now. And he said, I don't want to do it. I'm not going to come. And I was basically saying, you have to come.
It wasn't ideal, but it was far from a crisis yet. Instead, the UFC booked the next biggest fight available to them, the Jon Jones-Daniel Cormier rematch. And below it, they had a star-studded lineup. Amanda Nunes versus Miesha Tate, Jose Aldo was there, Cain Velasquez versus Travis Browne, and TJ Dillashaw was on the prelims. But the next biggest star, the return of Brock Lesnar, a story that Ariel Helwani supposedly leaked ahead of the UFC's official announcement, causing a massive drama between him and Dana White.
So we go to the back. It was just a hallway, a few steps from the media room. The main event's about to start, by the way. And Dana White is there. Some other members of his team are there, and he just says to me, "You're out. Get out of here. You're done. We don't want you here anymore. Go to Bellator."
But either way, it was an amazing card on paper and looked to be the greatest UFC event ever. Just 3 days out though, the chaos started, and unsurprisingly, it was Jon Jones' fault.
Come on. Come on.
I know, bro. Fuck, I'm so sorry.
Come on.
Jones had tested positive for 2 separate PEDs, and while it was confirmed he had unknowingly taken a tainted supplement, he was banned for a year and removed from the main event.
The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency has informed Jon Jones of a potential anti-doping policy violation stemming from an out-of-competition sample collection on June 16th, 2016.
So with just 48 hours until the event, it was announced another GOAT was taking his place to fight DC. It was a bit of a weird matchup, but not the worst. When the supposed biggest show of MMA history went down though, it just felt like an enormous anticlimax. There was the gross gold canvas in the octagon to begin with, then the big fights were just dull. DC played it safe and wrestled Anderson. Lesnar did the same against Mark Hunt, and while Amanda Nunes destroyed Miesha Tate in the new main event, it didn't have that massive fight feel. And then the week later, news broke that most UFC fans were expecting. Brock Lesnar had tested positive, and the fight turned to a no contest.
That was the biggest fucking embarrassment of the year.
Why would that be?
Embarrassment, bro.
What was embarrassing?
Just embarrassing him against Mark Hunt. They knew he was on the juice. He went in there loaded to the gills. It was just an embarrassing thing. It was an embarrassing thing for everybody. And Mark Hunt had every right to be mad.
It was just a bit of a sham. We all knew Lesnar was on something, yet he was somehow given a bypass on the USADA requirements to be tested for 6 months before competition. Ultimately, UFC 200 went down in the history books as a bit of a disaster. And speaking of disasters, we need to talk about UFC 223 and a certain bus. Originally, UFC 223 was headlined by Khabib and Tony Ferguson, the 4th time they were set to fight. And it might sound like a joke, but Tony tripped on a cable during an interview and tore his LCL.
Wow, so it was just a freak accident. You're at the Fox lot, you turn to see someone and you trip, and what do you feel?
I mean, a lot.
Had it not been for that one silly wire, all the chaos that went down wouldn't have happened. In Tony's place, featherweight champion Max Holloway was coming up a division on less than a week's notice in what would be a real marquee fight. But while that was the main event, there were some other serious distractions during fight week. Khabib had some hotel corridor beef with McGregor's teammate Artem Lobov. That clip went viral, triggering Conor McGregor to round up 20 of his crew, hop on a plane to New York, and get their revenge. And just a couple of days later, they did just that.
What the fuck? You you!
Back it out! You get the camera there. Watch out! Sit down! Sit down! What the f? Dude, what the f? Hey, what the f? Oh shit! Just get back. What the f? You alright, Mike?
The shattered window ending up causing both Michael Chiesa and Ray Borg cuts to their face, causing both of their respective fights to get cancelled due to Conor's actions. The UFC's biggest stars ended up in handcuffs and charged with multiple criminal offenses, and Khabib was pleading for a street fight.
Just send me a message. Of course they know a lot of security here, media, it's gonna be big, you understand, they come with 30 people. Come here. Send me a message, like location, I'm gonna come. Whatever you want, doesn't matter. Ireland, New York, Brooklyn, or Moscow, doesn't matter. Tell me, where?
And if that wasn't enough, there was much more drama to go down. On the day of the weigh-ins, Max Holloway was medically pulled from the fight by the Athletic Commission as he was seriously struggling with a weight cut. Initially, the UFC wanted Paul Felder, who was competing at the event, to step up and face Khabib, but due to him being unranked, the commission said no.
It really sucks that after my last fight and a 3-fight win streak that they didn't put me in that top 15 after that, because if they had, tonight and tomorrow could have been different thing for me, just historically and financially.
So instead, Al Iaquinta was the one to fight Khabib. But as he weighed in at 155.2 pounds, that .2 made him ineligible to win the title should he pull off the crazy upset. All this chaos just a day before the event. Of course, Khabib ended up winning the title in a pretty lackluster event that is remembered for the bus incident. But it was a whole lot more dramatic than just that. But that rivalry between Conor and Khabib leads us to UFC 229, the biggest pay-per-view in UFC history that ended in an all-out brawl. Everything going into the event was pretty ordinary. We had the normal press conference build-up, albeit with Conor being a little crazy, an okay card, and no drama at the weigh-ins.
It's his birthday.
I'm gonna go like
yeah, join the bus. Happy birthday, join the bus.
I don't drink.
Why don't you drink?
I don't drink.
Why don't you drink?
I never drink.
I'll tell you some buzz at parties.
I never drink.
You mad backwards cunt. You're dead when I get my hands on you, do you hear me?
I never
You're
drink.
f***ing dead.
For the UFC, this would end up being the most watched show in the history of the sport. It was a real showcase of how far MMA had come over the years, and they needed it to go smoothly. But UFC 229 was totally ruined by what would happen after the fights. Khabib would dominate McGregor, eventually submitting him in the 4th round. And then, as we all know it, he lost it. All the build-up, all the pressure, all the eyeballs were too much, and Khabib toppled the octagon and started a riot with McGregor's team. He was throwing punches, Khabib's team climbed into the octagon and sucker punched McGregor. It was mayhem.
The whole thing was nuts, but the idea that we should be shocked after him throwing a dolly at a bus because Khabib's on the bus, those Russians don't fucking play like that, man.
Yeah. Police got involved to escort the fighters out. Eventually, they got Khabib back into the octagon, but Dana didn't even want to strap the belt around his waist so as to not infuriate the crowd even further. All this carnage on the biggest card ever, it was truly an embarrassing moment for the sport. This was the breakout event, showcasing to the world how far the sport had come, but the incident ended up setting the sport back 10 years.
We were talking about this fight as the biggest fight that the UFC has ever put on, and then this happens with that magnitude of an audience watching it. Is this a bad night for the UFC, for the sport?
It's a very bad night. Yeah.
How bad?
Pretty bad. I mean, super duper, really super bad. I mean, the worst.
Even in 2026, when you think Khabib versus Conor, you immediately think of the brawl. And then this next one is undoubtedly the most chaotic UFC event of all time. The original plan for UFC 279 was Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz, one that people thought was a big fight, sure, but a huge mismatch.
We're getting to the point where someone should start thinking about pressing charges. It doesn't feel like a fair fight. It feels like a very, very cruel thing to do to someone that is a legitimate legend. Because they've spoken out against the organization, they're going to get executed live on TV. That's kind of how it feels. And it makes me feel uncomfortable to think that that's the way it's going to go down.
But also competing on the card was the loudmouth Kevin Holland. So with him, Chimaev, and Diaz, there was the perfect storm of crazy UFC fighters to cause drama, and they caused a serious amount.
Say something now, you. You're not about that life, kid. You're not about it, kid. You're my. You piece of. Talk in interviews now. Say something, you know. Everyone like playing gangsters now. Come on, come here. Them both. Yeah, I say it happen.
That was the aftermath of an enormous brawl between Chimaev and Holland's teams, with Diaz and his team joining in. But this was moments before the press conference, and fans had no idea what had just happened. Then, suddenly out of nowhere, Dana White did something he's likely never done in UFC history.
Yeah, this ain't gonna happen. I apologize, everybody. I am in very weird waters here. This has never happened in the history of this company. So, trust me when I tell you this is the right decision not to do this press conference right now. And yeah, I hear you. I'm with you. But for everybody's safety, this is the right decision.
It was absolute confusion for UFC fans, but seemingly that was that. Chimaev would go on to fight Diaz, Holland, and would face Daniel Rodriguez and Ferguson against Li Jingliang. But not a single one of those fights would happen, all because of one incident.
$178.5.
Not that bad.
178.5, the official weight for Khamzat Chimaev.
Chimaev missed weight by 7.5 pounds. As a result, the UFC rebuilt the entire main card on just 24 hours notice. Diaz ended up fighting Tony Ferguson. Chimaev fought Kevin Holland, and D-Rod faced Lee. And credit to all the fighters for accepting different opponents the day before they were set to compete. It was arguably a better main card with more drama due to the brawl and better match fights than before. In the end, Diaz submitted Tony Ferguson, and Chimaev utterly ran through Kevin Holland in a couple of minutes. But for those few hours from when Chimaev stepped on the scale to the entire main card shuffling around, it was pandemonium and a card that will never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. We recently made a deep dive on the 7 levels of industry plants in the UFC. If you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely want to check that one out here.